The first pale light of dawn crept across the Montana Territory, casting long shadows between the weathered buildings of Willow Creek. Judge Thaddeus Kane stood at his office window, watching the mist rise from the creek that gave the town its name. At 62, his hair had gone silver white, but his blue eyes remained sharp as a hawk's. The weight of 20 years on the bench had carved deep lines around those eyes, each one telling the story of difficult decisions made in this harsh land where civilization met the untamed wilderness. A sharp knock interrupted his morning contemplation. "Come in," he called, already knowing what news awaited him. Sheriff Tom Bradley entered, his weathered face grim beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Judge, we got ourselves a situation. My deputies brought in a young Crow woman last night. Found her near the Henderson Ranch with what looked like stolen cattle." Kane turned from the window, his expression carefully neutral. "What's her story?" "She ain't talking much English, but from what I can gather, she claims the cattle wandered onto tribal land. Says she was just driving them back." Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "Thing is, Judge, old man Henderson's been missing 3 days now. His foreman's saying she might know something about that, too." The judge's jaw tightened. Relations between the growing settlement and the Crow Nation had been tense since the railroad announced plans to extend their line through traditional hunting grounds. Any incident now could spark the kind of violence that would leave both sides bloodied and bitter. "Have you sent word to the reservation?" Kane asked, settling behind his desk. "No, sir. Figured we'd best handle this quiet-like, at least until we know what we're dealing with." Bradley's hand rested unconsciously on his gun belt. "But Judge, there's something else. Early this morning, my deputies reported seeing riders on the hills surrounding town. Lots of them." Kane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How many?" "Hard to say for certain in the dim light, but—" Bradley paused, meeting the judge's steady gaze. "Could be near 200, sir. They're keeping their distance for now, but they're watching." The judge rose and walked to a cabinet, withdrawing a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. He poured modest amounts and offered one to the sheriff. 20 years I've been dispensing justice in this territory, Tom. I've seen settlers hung for crimes they didn't commit, and I've seen guilty men walk free because the evidence wasn't strong enough. But I've never had 200 warriors waiting to see how I handle a case." Bradley accepted the glass, but didn't drink. "What do you want to do, Judge?" Kane moved to a framed photograph on his desk, showing a younger version of himself standing beside a Native American man in traditional dress. "You remember Standing Bear, Tom? The Crow chief who helped us through that bad winter of '69. Course I do. He taught me something about justice that day. Said his people believe that every action creates ripples, like stones thrown in still water. The size of the stone determines the size of the ripples." Kane's finger traced the glass frame. This young woman might be a very large stone indeed. The sheriff finally took a sip of his whiskey. "Henderson's foreman is pushing hard for a quick trial. Says if we don't make an example, every brave in the territory will think they can steal from white folks with impunity." Kane's eyes hardened. James Crawley has never been known for his wisdom or his patience. "What's your read on the girl?" "She's scared, but she's got pride. Won't back down from her story about the cattle. And, Judge," Bradley hesitated, "there's something about her eyes. Reminds me of my daughter when she's telling the truth about something she knows folks won't want to hear." Before Kane could respond, the door burst open without ceremony. James Crawley strode in, his spurs jangling and his face flushed with anger. a tall, lean man with cold gray eyes. He'd been Henderson's foreman for 5 years and had earned a reputation for ruthless efficiency in dealing with what he called Indian problems. "Judge Kane, I demand justice for my employer," Crawley declared, ignoring the sheriff's disapproving glare. "That savage woman stole Henderson's cattle and likely killed him too. Every minute she sits in a cell instead of swinging from a rope is an insult to every decent Christian in this territory." Kane's voice remained level, but there was steel beneath it. "Mr. Crawley, in my courtroom, we determine guilt through evidence and testimony, not through assumptions and prejudice. Have you found Henderson's body? Well, no, but have you found any evidence linking the young woman to violence against Henderson?" Crawley's jaw worked furiously. "She was found with stolen cattle, wasn't she? That's evidence enough for any reasonable man. Evidence of cattle rustling, perhaps, but that's a far cry from murder." Kane moved closer to Crawley, his presence commanding despite being several inches shorter. "And I'll remind you that in my courtroom, we deal in facts, not inflammatory accusations." The foreman's hand moved toward his gun, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Sheriff Bradley, who stepped forward slightly. "You're making a mistake, Judge. Those savages on the hills are waiting to see if you'll let one of their own get away with attacking a white man. Show weakness now, and we'll have a full uprising on our hands." Kane's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Weakness? You mistake measured justice for weakness, Mr. Crawley. I've seen what happens when fear drives decisions in this territory. Good men die, and bad men use the chaos to profit." "Henderson was a good man," Crawley snarled. "Henderson was a man, neither particularly good nor particularly bad. But if he's truly dead, he deserves justice based on truth, not vengeance based on assumption." The tension in the room was thick as smoke when Deputy Martinez burst through the door. "Judge, Sheriff, you need to see this." He was breathing hard, as if he'd run the entire distance from the jail. "What is it, Carlos?" Bradley demanded. "The Crow girl, sir. She's asking for you specifically, Judge Kane. Says she has something important to tell you, and—" Martinez glanced nervously at Crawley. "She says she knows where Henderson is." The revelation hit the room like a lightning strike. Crawley stepped forward aggressively. "See, I knew she was involved in his disappearance." But Kane was already moving toward the door. "Tom, escort Mr. Crawley out. I need to speak with the prisoner alone." "Like hell I'm leaving," Crawley protested. "I have a right to hear what that woman has to say about my employer." The judge turned, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing the iron will that had kept peace in Willow Creek for 2 decades. "Mr. Crawley, you have exactly 2 choices. You can walk out of this office with your dignity intact, or Sheriff Bradley can escort you out in a manner befitting your current behavior. Either way, you're leaving, now." Crawley looked between the judge and the sheriff, recognizing that he was outnumbered and outranked. "This ain't over, Kane. There are folks in this territory who won't stand for you coddling savages while white men disappear." "I'm sure there are," Kane replied evenly. "But in this courtroom, I answer to the law, not to mob sentiment." After Crawley stormed out, Kane and Bradley walked across the dusty street toward the jail. The morning sun was climbing higher, and already Kane could see townspeople gathering in small groups, their faces showing the kind of tension that preceded violence. Word was spreading quickly about the Crow warriors on the hills and the imprisoned woman in their jail. The jail was a sturdy stone building, one of the few structures in Willow Creek built to last. Inside, the cells were clean but sparse, designed more for temporary detention than long-term imprisonment. The young Crow woman sat on a narrow cot in the corner cell, her dark hair braided with colorful beads, her buckskin dress dusty from her time on the trail. When Kane approached her cell, she looked up with eyes that held both defiance and intelligence. "You are the one they called Judge?" she asked in accented but clear English. Kane nodded. I am Judge Kane. What's your name, miss? I am Morning Star, daughter of Chief Iron Hawk. Her chin lifted proudly. I did not steal cattle from the white man. The cattle came onto our land. I was returning them, as our treaty says we must do with lost animals. My deputy says you have information about Henderson, the ranch owner. Morning Star stood and moved closer to the bars, her dark eyes intense. The old man with gray whiskers, he is not dead, but he is in great danger. 3 suns ago, I found him by the creek, hurt and confused. Men had beaten him and left him for dead. Kane felt his pulse quicken. What men? Did you recognize them? White men. One had a scar here. She traced a line down her left cheek. Another was very tall, with eyes like winter ice. They spoke of taking his ranch, said he had refused to sell to the Iron Horse people. The description of the tall man with cold eyes was unmistakable. Kane glanced at Bradley, who was frowning deeply. Where is Henderson now? The judge asked. My people found him and took him to our village for healing. He lives, but his head was hurt badly. He speaks of strange dreams and sometimes does not know where he is. Kane's mind raced through the implications. If Morning Star was telling the truth, Henderson was alive but being hidden by the Crow, while she was imprisoned for trying to return his own cattle. Meanwhile, the real perpetrators, likely in Crawley, were free and possibly planning to claim Henderson's property. Why didn't your people simply return Henderson to town? Bradley asked. Morning Star's expression grew somber. Because the men who hurt him wear badges. My father did not know which white men could be trusted. When I volunteered to return the cattle and test the hearts of the town's leaders, he agreed it was wise. The words hit Kane like a physical blow. Men with badges? You're certain? Yes, I saw the metal stars when they rode away. They thought Henderson was dead, spoke freely of their plans. Her eyes bore into Kane's. That is why I asked for you, Judge Kane. Standing Bear, who was my grandfather's friend, spoke of you. He said you were a man who sought truth over convenience. Kane closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. If corrupt lawmen were involved in Henderson's beating and attempted murder, the situation was far more dangerous than a simple case of cattle rustling. The warriors on the hills weren't just protecting Morning Star. They were waiting to see if the white man's justice could be trusted. Judge, Bradley said quietly, if she's telling the truth about corrupt badges, then we have bigger problems than cattle rustling, Kane finished. Miss Morning Star, these men you saw, would you recognize them again? Yes, the scarred one, I have seen him before. He rides with the man who was just in your office, the one who smells of anger and whiskey. Kane's blood chilled. Crawley and his associates hadn't just stolen cattle. They'd tried to murder Henderson for his land, then used the investigation to frame Morning Star and potentially start a conflict that would drive the Crow from their territory permanently. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his thoughts. Through the small window, Kane could see a group of armed men riding toward the jail, Crawley at their head. Morning Star moved to the window and looked out, her face growing pale. Judge Kane, she said quietly, I think your test has begun. The group of armed riders pulled up outside the jail with a cloud of dust and the jangling of spurs. Kane counted 12 men, all heavily armed and wearing the grim expressions of those who'd already decided on their course of action. Crawley dismounted and strode toward the jail entrance with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. Judge Kane, Crawley called out before he even reached the door, we've come to take the prisoner off your hands, save you the trouble of a trial. Kane stepped outside, Bradley flanking him with his hand resting on his gun. Mr. Crawley, vigilante justice has no place in my jurisdiction. The woman will receive a proper trial according to the law. One of the mounted men, a scarred individual Kane recognized as Dutch Keller, spat tobacco juice into the dust. Law's fine for regular folks, Judge, but when it comes to dealing with savages who kill white men, sometimes the law ain't fast enough. The description matched perfectly with Morningstar's account. Kane studied Keller's face, noting the jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. This was one of the men who'd beaten Henderson and left him for dead. "No one has been killed, Mr. Keller. In fact, I have reason to believe Henderson may still be alive." The reaction was immediate and telling. Crawley's confident demeanor flickered for just a moment, while Keller's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. It was a small gesture, but Kane had spent 20 years watching men's reactions to unexpected news. These men had been counting on Henderson being dead. "That's impossible," Crawley said, recovering his composure. "We searched for 3 days. If Henderson was alive, we would have found him." "Perhaps you weren't looking in the right places," Kane replied evenly. "Or perhaps you weren't looking at all." The tension ratcheted up another notch. The mounted men shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to weapons. From the corner of his eye, Kane could see townspeople beginning to emerge from buildings, drawn by the commotion but staying at a safe distance. Crawley stepped closer, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a reasonable tone. "Judge, you're a smart man. Look around you." He gestured toward the hills, where the morning sun revealed the silhouettes of mounted warriors. "Those savages have us outnumbered 10-1. The only thing standing between this town and a massacre is strength. Show them we won't be intimidated." "What I see," Kane replied, "is a young woman accused of returning stolen cattle to their rightful owner, and a group of armed men demanding I ignore due process. Which scenario sounds more threatening to you?" Dutch Keller urged his horse forward. "You're making a mistake, old man. That Indian bitch knows something about Henderson's disappearance, and we aim to find out what." Kane's voice turned cold as winter steel. "Mr. Keller, you'll watch your language when addressing this court, or you'll find yourself sharing a cell with the defendant." Keller laughed harshly. "You and what army, Judge? Your sheriff and his 2 deputies against all of us?" The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the standoff. Kane turned to see a lone rider approaching at a steady pace, and his heart lifted with relief. Chief Ironhawk rode with the natural dignity that Kane remembered from their previous meetings, his gray-streaked hair braided with eagle feathers, his weathered face calm but alert. Ironhawk dismounted and approached the group, ignoring the hostile stares of Crawley's men. "Judge Kane," he said in perfect English, "I have come to speak for my daughter." Crawley stepped between them. "No savages allowed in this discussion, Chief. Your daughter is our prisoner now." Ironhawk's dark eyes fixed on Crawley with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "My daughter is accused of stealing cattle that wandered onto tribal land. Under the treaty signed by your government and mine, such disputes are to be handled through proper legal channels, not by armed mobs." Kane seized the opportunity. "Chief Ironhawk, your daughter claims to have information about the whereabouts of the missing rancher, Henderson. Would you be willing to share what you know?" The chief nodded slowly. "The man you seek lives. 3 days ago, my daughter found him beaten and left to die beside the creek. We took him to our village for healing. He lives, but his mind wanders from his injuries." The revelation hit Crawley's group like a thunderbolt. Kane watched as several of the men exchanged worried glances. Dutch Keller's scarred face had gone pale, and his hand now openly rested on his gun butt. "You're lying," Crawley snarled. "If Henderson was alive, why didn't you return him to town?" Ironhawk's expression didn't change. "Because the men who beat him wore the metal stars of your law. My daughter saw them clearly. One looked much like that man there." The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Kane saw the moment when the pretense finally crumbled from Crawley's face, replaced by the cold calculation of a cornered predator. "Chief, you old fool," Crawley said with quiet menace. "You just signed death warrants for half your tribe. Nobody's going to believe the word of a savage over decent white men." "They might believe the word of the men you tried to murder," Kane interjected.
"Chief Ironhawk, would Henderson be willing to testify about what happened to him?" "When his mind clears, yes. But there are things he remembers even in his confusion. Names spoken by his attackers. Plans discussed while they thought he was dead." Dutch Keller had heard enough. His gun cleared leather with the speed of a professional killer, aimed directly at Ironhawk's chest. "Shut your lying mouth, Redskin, before—" The shot echoed across the dusty street, but it wasn't Keller who fired. Sheriff Bradley's Colt was smoking in his hand, while Keller clutched his shattered wrist, his gun lying in the dust. "Dutch Keller," Bradley announced in a carrying voice, "you're under arrest for the attempted murder of William Henderson and conspiracy to commit land fraud." Chaos erupted. Crawley's men reached for their weapons, while Bradley's two deputies emerged from strategic positions, their rifles trained on the group. Kane had always known Tom Bradley was a good sheriff, but the man's tactical preparation impressed him. "Hold it right there," Deputy Martinez called from the roof of the general store. "Anyone who draws iron is going to get acquainted with my Winchester." Ironhawk remained perfectly calm throughout the chaos, his eyes fixed on Kane. "Judge Kane, my daughter spoke truly of your character, but I fear this confrontation is far from over." Kane nodded grimly. On the hills surrounding the town, he could see movement among the warriors. They'd witnessed the drawn weapons and were likely preparing for the possibility that their chief might be harmed. Crawley, seeing his advantage slipping away, played his last card. "You're all making a fatal mistake. Judge, you think you're smart, but you don't understand the forces at play here. The railroad company has already paid for Henderson's land. Whether he's dead or alive doesn't matter. That property is going to change hands one way or another." "Very good, Judge," Crawley sneered. "Except you figured it out too late to matter. My employer has resources you can't imagine, and they don't take kindly to obstacles." Kane's blood chilled as he realized the full scope of the conspiracy. This wasn't just about one ranch or one corrupt foreman. It was about the systematic displacement of the Crow Nation to clear the way for railroad expansion. "Sheriff Bradley," Kane said formally, "arrest James Crawley for conspiracy, attempted murder, and cattle theft." Bradley moved toward Crawley, but the foreman raised his hand. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Sheriff. Look around." Kane's heart sank as he followed Crawley's gaze. More armed men were emerging from buildings around the town square, men who'd clearly been positioned in advance. The spontaneous mob had been anything but spontaneous. This was a coordinated effort to eliminate the obstacles to the railroad's expansion. From the jail came the sound of breaking wood. Through the window, Kane could see that someone had smashed the lock on Morningstar's cell. The young woman appeared in the doorway, her wrists still bound but her expression determined. "Father," she called in the Crow language, then switched to English. "Judge Kane." The old man Henderson spoke names in his fever dreams, names of men who planned his death. Crawley's face went white with rage. "Shut her up, Dutch." But Dutch Keller was still writhing on the ground, clutching his wounded wrist. The balance of power was shifting, but Kane could see it was far from settled. Armed men loyal to the railroad surrounded them, while on the hills, 200 Crow warriors waited for a sign from their chief. Iron Hawk stepped closer to Kane, speaking quietly. "Judge, my daughter told me something else. Henderson spoke of papers hidden in his house. Papers that prove the railroad company tried to buy his land illegally without government authorization for the route change." Kane's mind raced.
If such documents existed, they would expose not just local corruption, but potentially a massive federal crime involving unauthorized railroad expansion onto treaty lands. Judge Kane, Crawley said, his voice now carrying a note of desperation masked as threat. You have one chance to walk away from this. Release my men, hand over the Indian girl, and forget everything you've heard here today. Otherwise, this town is going to burn, and every death will be on your conscience. The judge looked around at the faces surrounding him. The corrupt men with their guns drawn, the frightened townspeople peering from windows, the patient warriors on the hills, and the determined faces of Iron Hawk and his daughter. He thought of the photograph on his desk, of Standing Bear's words about ripples in still water. Morning Star stepped forward, her bound hands extended toward Kane. Judge, my grandfather Standing Bear said you were a man who understood that justice is like water. It must flow freely or it becomes poisoned. The choice of how it flows rests with you. Kane looked up at the hills, where the morning sun now fully illuminated the waiting warriors. 200 braves, armed and ready, waiting to see if the white man's justice could be trusted. Sheriff Bradley, Kane said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street, I want you to place James Crawley under arrest and send Deputy Martinez to Henderson's ranch to search for the documents mentioned by our witness. Crawley's laugh was harsh and desperate. You've just killed everyone in this town, Judge.
When those savages come down from the hills, those savages, Kane interrupted, are the only reason this town isn't already burning. They're the only thing standing between you and the consequences of your own actions. As if responding to his words, Ironhawk raised his hand toward the hills. The gesture was subtle, but Kane saw immediate movement among the warriors. They were preparing for something, but whether it was attack or withdrawal remained to be seen. The morning sun climbed higher, and Kane realized that the day was far from over. The immediate confrontation might be controlled, but the larger forces at play, the railroad company, the federal government, the rights of the Crow Nation, were beyond his small courtroom's jurisdiction. Judge, Morningstar said quietly, there is something else my father should tell you, about the papers Henderson hid, and about the men who are coming from the territorial capital. Kane felt his stomach drop. What men? Ironhawk's expression grew grave. Federal marshals, Judge Kane. They arrived today, with orders to resolve the Indian problem by whatever means necessary. The sound of approaching horses from the east confirmed Ironhawk's warning. Kane squinted against the morning sun and counted 6 riders, wearing the distinctive badges of federal marshals. Their leader, a tall man with graying temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, rode slightly ahead of the others. Judge Kane, the lead marshal called out as they approached, I'm Marshal Robert Thornton, Territorial District Supervisor. I've been sent to resolve the situation here before it escalates into a full Indian war. Kane stepped forward, his mind racing through the implications. Federal involvement meant the stakes had risen beyond local politics. Someone with serious influence had decided the situation in Willow Creek required intervention at the highest levels. Marshal Thornton, I appreciate your concern, but the situation is well in hand. We've apprehended the parties responsible for the crimes against William Henderson. Thornton dismounted with fluid grace, his steel-gray eyes taking in the scene. The wounded Dutch Keller, the armed standoff, the Crow warriors visible on the surrounding hills. Judge, with respect, a town surrounded by 200 hostile Indians doesn't look like a situation under control. Crowley seized the opportunity. Marshal, thank God you're here. Judge Kane has lost his mind. He's taking the word of savages over decent white men, and he's about to start a war that will get everyone killed. Thornton's attention sharpened on Crowley. And you are? James Crawley, foreman of the Henderson Ranch.
I've been trying to bring the people responsible for my employer's disappearance to justice, but the judge here seems more interested in protecting Indian criminals than finding the truth. Kane saw the careful way Thornton evaluated Crowley's words and felt a flicker of hope.
The federal marshal struck him as a man who'd learned to separate truth from convenient lies. "Mr. Crawley, I've read the reports about your employer's disappearance. However, I've also received some interesting telegraph messages from the territorial capital." Thornton's voice carried a subtle warning. Messages that suggest this situation is more complex than a simple case of cattle rustling. Ironhawk stepped forward with dignified calm. "Marshal Thornton, I am Chief Ironhawk of the Crow Nation. My daughter was accused of stealing cattle that had wandered onto tribal lands. She was attempting to return them when your people arrested her." "Chief Ironhawk?" Thornton nodded respectfully. "I'm aware of your reputation as a man of peace, but I'm also aware that you have 200 warriors positioned around this town. That doesn't suggest peaceful intentions." "My warriors wait to see if white man's justice can be trusted," Ironhawk replied simply. "For too long, treaties have been broken, promises forgotten. My daughter's treatment will determine whether my people still believe in the possibility of fair dealing." Thornton's expression grew thoughtful. "Chief, I understand your concerns, but surely you must realize that the presence of so many armed warriors appears threatening to the townsfolk." Morningstar spoke up from where she stood beside her father. "Marshal, may I tell you what I saw 3 days ago?" Kane watched Thornton's reaction carefully. The federal marshal was clearly intelligent and experienced, but which way would his loyalties lie when forced to choose between competing versions of events? "Young lady, you're the accused party here. While I'll certainly hear your statement, I hope you understand that your word alone cannot—" "Her word is not alone," Ironhawk interrupted quietly. "The man they claim is dead lives in our village. When his mind clears from his injuries, he speaks of the men who beat him and left him to die." Thornton's eyebrows rose. "Henderson is alive." "Very much so," Kane confirmed. "And according to both Morningstar and her father, he was attacked by men wearing badges, men who bear a remarkable resemblance to some of those standing here today." Crawley's face flushed red with anger. "That's a damned lie. These savages are trying to cover up their own crimes by—" "Mr. Crawley," Thornton's voice cut through the protest like a blade. "I'd advise you to watch your language and your accusations. I've been investigating railroad land acquisitions throughout the territory, and your employer's ranch has come up in several concerning reports." The words hit like a physical blow. Kane saw the blood drain from Crawley's face as the implication sank in. The federal government wasn't just responding to the immediate crisis, they were investigating the larger conspiracy. "Furthermore," Thornton continued, "I have a warrant to search the Henderson Ranch for documents related to illegal land acquisition schemes. Documenten that, if they exist, would constitute evidence of federal crimes." Dutch Keller, still clutching his wounded wrist, snarled from where he sat in the dust. "You're all making a big mistake. The people we work for have friends in Washington. Real friends, not just some territorial nobody wearing a badge." Thornton's smile was cold as mountain ice. "Mr. Keller, the territorial nobody you're referring to reports directly to the Attorney General. And the Attorney General has become very interested in railroad companies that seem to think federal law doesn't apply to them." Kane felt a surge of hope. The federal investigation meant that the local corruption was part of a much larger pattern, one that had finally attracted attention at the highest levels of government. "Marshal," Kane said, "if you'll permit me to make a suggestion, perhaps we could resolve this situation in a way that serves justice and prevents bloodshed." "I'm listening, Judge." "Chief Ironhawk, would your people be willing to bring Henderson to town so he can testify about what happened to him?" Ironhawk considered for a moment. "If you give your word that he will be protected and that his testimony will be heard fairly, yes." Thornton nodded.
Chief, you have my personal guarantee that Henderson will be protected and his testimony given full weight. But I need your word that your warriors will not attack this town. My warriors defend my daughter and my people, Ironhawk replied. If justice is done fairly, there will be no need for weapons. Kane looked around at the tense faces surrounding them. The immediate crisis seemed to be diffusing, but he knew the real test would come when Henderson testified and the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "There's something else," Morningstar said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathering. "The papers Henderson spoke of in his fever. I know where they are hidden." All eyes turned to her. Crawley's face had gone ashen, while Thornton leaned forward with obvious interest. "Henderson dug a hole beneath the floorboards of his kitchen," Morningstar continued. "Before the men beat him, he hid a leather pouch there. He spoke of it when the fever dreams took him, saying the papers would prove the railroads tried to steal his land." Thornton immediately gestured to two of his deputies. "Ride to the Henderson ranch immediately. Find those documents and bring them back here." "Marshal," Crawley interjected desperately, "you can't take the word of an Indian girl over." "Mr. Crawley," Thornton's voice carried final authority, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit land fraud, attempted murder, and violation of federal statutes regarding Indian treaty rights. Anything you say can and will be used against you." The arrest seemed to break the spirit of resistance among Crawley's men. One by one, they began laying down their weapons as Thornton's marshals moved to secure them. Keller, still clutching his wounded wrist, glared at Kane with undisguised hatred. "This ain't over, Judge," Keller snarled. "You think you've won something here, but you have no idea how deep this goes." Kane met his stare calmly. "Mr. Keller, in my experience, when corruption is exposed to sunlight, it tends to wither quickly. I suspect your employers will find themselves too busy saving their own skins to worry about revenge." As the morning progressed, the promised documents were retrieved from Henderson's ranch and proved to be everything Morningstar had claimed. Railroad company correspondence, bribery receipts, and forged government authorizations painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached from the local level all the way to territorial officials. By noon, Henderson himself had been brought to town, weak but lucid enough to identify his attackers and confirm the details of Morningstar's account. The sight of the supposedly dead rancher walking into the courthouse caused a sensation among the townspeople, many of whom had been prepared to see Morningstar hanged for his murder. As the formal proceedings concluded, Kane found himself standing once again at his office window, watching Ironhawk prepare to leave with his daughter. The Crow warriors were already withdrawing from the hills, their presence no longer needed. Judge Kane, Morningstar approached with her father, no longer wearing the iron shackles that had bound her wrists. "My grandfather, Standing Bear, spoke truly of your character. You have shown that white man's justice can be trusted when it flows from an honest heart." Kane smiled, feeling the weight of the morning's events settling into relief. "Miss Morningstar, your courage in telling the truth, even when it put you in danger, made justice possible. Your people should be proud." Ironhawk extended his hand in the white man's gesture of respect. "Judge Payne, my people will remember this day. But there will be other days, other tests. The railroad company will not give up their plans easily." "No," Kane agreed, "but they'll have a much harder time implementing them now that the federal government is watching. And they'll know that not everyone in this territory can be bought or intimidated." As the Crow delegation rode away, Marshal Thornton approached Kane's office. "Judge, I wanted to thank you for your handling of this situation. Lesser men might have taken the easier path." Kane poured 2 glasses of whiskey from his cabinet, offering one to the federal marshal. "Marshal, in 20 years on this bench, I've learned that the easier path usually leads to the harder consequences. Today could have ended in a massacre if fear had won out over justice." Thornton accepted the glass and raised it in a brief toast. "To justice, Judge Kane, and to the hope that more men in positions of authority will choose principle over convenience."
As the sun set over Willow Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Kane reflected on Standing Bear's words about ripples in still water. Today's events would indeed create ripples, but they would be ripples of justice rather than violence, of truth rather than corruption. The railroad company's plans for the territory would face new scrutiny, and the Crow Nation had seen that some white men still honored their word. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Kane had lived too long on the frontier to believe in perfect endings, but it was honest justice, fairly administered. From his window, he could see the last of the Crow warriors disappearing into the gathering dusk, their silhouettes proud against the darkening sky. Morning Star rode beside her father, no longer a prisoner, but a young woman who had helped expose a conspiracy that could have destroyed both her people and the fragile peace of the territory. Kane raised his glass in a silent toast to the photograph on his desk, to Standing Bear's memory, and to the hope that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to choose justice over convenience. In the American West, where civilization and wilderness met in daily confrontation, such choices would always be necessary. Outside, the town of Willow Creek settled into evening quiet, its people safe in the knowledge that their judge had proven worthy of the trust they'd placed in him. The courthouse bell tolled the hour, its bronze voice carrying across the valley like a promise that justice, however difficult to achieve, would always be worth fighting for. In the growing darkness, Kane could just make out the creek that gave the town its name, flowing steadily toward the distant Missouri River. Like justice itself, it followed its natural course, persistent and patient, carving new channels when obstacles blocked its path. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of character and principle. But tonight, the water ran clear.